Today we're going to be talking about Columbus, what made his journey possible, and just what events led up to that. So it all kind of begins with my first point, which has to do with Islam and the Islamic culture. They did a couple of very, very important things, one of which was they kind of came up with this idea of holy war, which was you can spread your religious beliefs through force and less about, like philosophy in a way. Originally Christians really did not like this. They thought, that's, war is a necessity, not like a good thing, but eventually they kind of, succumbed to the temptation of just, following in holy war because you see a lot more value from it, I'd say. You kind of can take over an area and, they all kind of have to join your religion. And it's just ultimately seemed much more effective at the time. And so they kind of began with implementing this idea of holy war as well, which kind of is interesting because it shows the culture at the time, but also shows a bit of like actually why Columbus went to discover the New World in America. And that's kind of because he wanted to get riches to go to Jerusalem, to basically fund a war that could, take back Jerusalem. And this kind of shows that holy war idea principle. So without that idea, Columbus probably would never have even done this. So yeah, that's interesting. But additionally, the Islams developed a lot of artillery, weaponry, things like that, especially because they were, in the business of war. They kind of needed to be ahead of the game. This ultimately, just, things like cannons and stuff were made, and that just allowed for, a much higher technology wars to happen, and kind of leads up to what you kind of see today. It was part of that innovation in that kind of weapon artillery. So the Islamic people and Islam definitely did affect the world. They controlled a lot, they had a lot of power, and you're gonna see like throughout learning about this Columbus and what led up to it that Islam had a big part of it. But that's kind of gonna sum up my first reason. My second reason is going to have to do with global trade and kind of the economy of the situation at the time. So global trade is a really good thing, and essentially it happens when you have more of one resource than you're going to need. You have too much wheat or too much wood or whatever, and you can begin trading with other people. If this happens around the world, everyone can trade with each other, and allows them to pick like more narrow jobs, because they don't have to cover every area they need to survive. They different places, different people can do different things. So it just allowed for much more like specific jobs to be discovered, or not discovered, but used. And so yeah, global trade. Global trade was, I kind of began to be implemented because Islam was taking over a lot of the world, and they were kind of making the people productive. They were, innovating the farming technology and kind of things like that, and allowing to kind of, this rebirth of like, really effective farming and things like that. And it kind of just boosted this economy and allowed for global trade. Now, additionally with global trade, we gotta talk about the caravel. The caravel was a ship that like really changed a lot in this situation. And again, I don't really think Christopher Columbus would have made it to America if it weren't for like the caravel and just what it kind of did to the world. We are going to see, so it's, now let me explain what it is. I haven't done that yet. It's a ship that can, kind of a jack of all trades. It can sail with the wind, against the wind. It can sail in like shallow waters or in like deep waters. And because of that, it actually kind of allowed for this new era of like sea trading, and allowed for that to be possible. In specific, I'm going to be talking about Portugal and how they use sea trading. So first of all, let's talk about why they needed sea trading and like, trading by seas and such. Well, they were kind of cut off from land-based trading because of like Spain or the Spanish and like the Islamic Empire. So that being said, they couldn't really, they were pretty dependent on like, Spain and such to really get anywhere and do anything. They didn't really want that. They don't want to be dependent. So what they do is they set up these ports, they get a bunch of caravels, and they go. they're selling, you know, super valuable items, you know, a couple of which just like, you know, gold, ivory, cotton, sugar, slaves, and they're all valuable items at the time. In specific, let's look at, you know, sugar. Sugar was something everyone wanted, you know, everyone liked sugar, everyone wants sugar, and at this time it was fairly rare. Sicily was one of the few places that, you know, sugar could actually be grown, but, you know, because the reason is because in order to grow sugar, you need both a like really, really hot environment, but also really, really wet environment, and that was kind of rare. So Sicily could actually grow sugar, and so they were, you know, doing great, but I mean, obviously that's a really valuable spot then, right? You know, that is where kind of the economy is going to be. You know, everyone wants sugar, and that's where you get sugar. So there was these conquests to basically take over Sicily by like Islam, and so additionally, you know, the climate kind of just shifted away from that kind of, you know, super hot, super wet. So Sicily no longer became like a viable option to grow sugar. And so this would be a super, super, you know, unfortunate situation. But if we go back to Portugal, they actually took advantage of this situation. They essentially said, okay, you know, let's begin growing sugar. They realized that they had the climate needed, they had those like situations needed, and so they began doing it. And this was huge because now they could grow a really, really high demand, you know, object of sugar, and then they also had ways to sell them to people through their ships and their sea trading. So they are doing fantastic, right? They're doing absolutely fantastic. But Spain doesn't really like that. Spain's kind of like, okay, well, why? Like, you know, it just seems unfortunate, right? And so they kind of get mad at each other, and essentially, this is where they set up borders between each other, and basically say, you can't come on our land, we can't come on your land. Now, I'm sure at the time, Spain's philosophy was like, well, you know, sea trading can't last forever, right? And eventually they're gonna have to come on our land, and, you know, at that point, we can kind of create whatever circumstances we want. Portugal was like, oh, we'll just keep, you know, trading overseas, this is what we wanted. So, now we gotta talk about the Silk Road. So, the Silk Road was essentially this road that would travel. It was basically throughout, you know, the east to the west, Europe through Asia, you know, just goes all around. And basically, it allowed for really, really effective land trading. Now, it was additionally, the big point of the Silk Road was Constantinople. This is kind of the divider between the two, and that made it potentially the most valuable place, like, in the world to capture, take over. So the Muslims, you know, they see that, they know that, and what do they think? They think, I want it, right? We want to take over that. It essentially, Constantinople controlled trade, like, because everyone was trading in between these two at this point. But this ultimately allowed for this global trade that we want, but the Muslims go, they take over, and over Constantinople. Once they do this, global trade kind of dies. You can't trade between Europe and Asia really effectively anymore. And now, Spain was, you know, doing good, and I imagine Portugal was a bit upset with their deal. But now, things are looking absolutely great for Portugal, because every single place in Europe can only trade among people in Europe. But Portugal's fine. They can go, you know, sea trade and still get access to Asia, and, you know, ultimately they just had this great economic success. And here's where it kind of all ties in. So essentially, Spain is upset about this. They're like, man, like, we wanted to be ahead. We wanted to have this economic advantage, but it didn't work out, right? It's not happening. That's really unfortunate. But what if we had a way to trade with Asia? Now, so really, yeah, that's what they wanted. Kind of, you know, they were not necessarily enemies, but definitely kind of rivals with, you know, Portugal, and they wanted to get on even ground. Right now, Portugal was just, you know, economically better than everyone else in Europe, and they wanted to catch up. So Christopher Columbus comes along, and he says, guys, I have an idea. We can sail from the, like, instead of getting to Asia by going east, we can get to Asia by going west. You know, the world's smaller than we think, yada, 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 his whole story. This was a conspiracy theory, and it was kind of a, like, he was kind of crazy. I mean, you know, in the, like, you know, that idea was a crazy idea. Not, you know, no one believed it, but in this situation, Spain saw just a sliver of hope. They thought, if we could do this, we could potentially get to Asia. And if we can get to Asia, we can catch up to Portugal, and we can kind of begin thriving again. So that's kind of how he actually got the funding. Obviously, eventually, they figured out that Asia was not to their west, or at least there was a continent in between. And that's kind of how he got the funding and the opportunities to go to Asia. It's pretty much the whole story. But yeah, yeah, that's the end. Bye.